Elizabeth of York was the first Tudor queen, and her marriage to Henry VII ended the Wars of the Roses. But the death of Elizabeth brought great grief to the King of England, and he became so distraught that even his life became threatened as he was heartbroken. Henry VII was very sick following his wife's death, but the usually frugal and tight king spent a huge sum in organising a huge burial procession for his wife. He also had a huge tomb commissioned for her, and inside of Westminster Abbey, and today Elizabeth and Henry are buried still there, at the heart of the great mausoleum known as the Lady Chapel. But in the years immediately after her death, Elizabeth of York's burial vault was disturbed, and she was exhumed and then moved, and in the years following her remains were disturbed further, as there was a significant degree of change to those who were buried inside of the burial vault. In fact, a long-lost king was actually discovered buried next to her. Today, we look at opening the coffin of the very first Tudor queen, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Elizabeth of York played little role in the politics of running England following her marriage to King Henry VII, but she was by all accounts a good counsel and a strong woman. She was a good mother to raising her son, Henry, who would become Henry VIII, but also she experienced a significant amount of hardship as her eldest son, Arthur, the heir to Henry VII's throne, died. But Elizabeth of York became pregnant in 1502, and she spent time in her confinement inside the Tower of London. Because you see, at the time, the Tower of London was not so much a prison or a site of torture, and it was a rather luxurious royal residence and a place where kings and queens would stay and put their households, but it was where Elizabeth would be until she gave birth. The tradition was that men would not see the pregnant lady until the child was born, and on the 2nd of February 1503, Elizabeth of York gave birth to a daughter named Catherine, after her daughter-in-law Catherine of Aragon, but her daughter died a few days later and did not survive, and the death rate for infants in the Tudor period was very high. But more heartbreak would come, as on the 11th of February 1503, Elizabeth of York herself died inside the tower, succumbing to what has been mostly accepted as postpartum infection or childbirth fever. This death devastated her husband, Henry VII, and the rest of the royal family were distraught, and it was claimed that the king privily departed to a solitary place, and would no man should resort unto him, and he allegedly became deathly ill due to grief, and his mother had to nurse him better. King Henry VII had lost his heir and son, and also his wife and daughter, in just over 2 years, and he had also sent his other daughter Margaret to Scotland to marry. Her funeral was huge, and it cost the royal family a huge sum of money. It was a funeral befitting a queen, and Elizabeth's coffin was draped in cloth of gold and was watched over for 9 nights by her ladies-in-waiting, 4 gentlewomen, 2 officers of arms, and 7 yeomen and grooms. There were daily masses sung for her, and the coffins, as then on the day of the funeral, taken to Westminster Abbey, being pulled on a hearse by 6 horses, all draped in black velvet. Behind the coffin rode her 8 ladies-in-waiting, and there was a huge funeral procession made up of hundreds of people, and the path from the Tower of London to Westminster Abbey was marked by 5,000 torches, which were lit, and candles. The coffin arrived at Westminster Abbey, and it was then placed on the high altar, which was surrounded by 1,000 candles. Elizabeth of York's corpse had been, in the days following her death, been embalmed, and her vital organs were cut from her body, and her corpse was also wrapped in a thick wax-dipped cloth known as cerecloth, which formed a physical barrier to decay and decomposition. At the funeral, on the coffin, there was also a large lifelike effigy of the Queen, and on this the head of her was very rich crown, and her fingers had many rings of them with precious stones. When it was time for her final burial inside of Westminster Abbey, the effigy was removed from the coffin, and her ladies draped her coffin with 37 pieces of gold cloth, and Elizabeth of York's coffin was then lowered into a grave. However, her initial place of burial was not inside the Lady Chapel where the tomb is today, as this building work had not been finished. Elizabeth of York was temporarily interred inside of a vault within Westminster Abbey, and following the death of Henry VII, the body of Elizabeth was moved to the new tomb that had been made for her and her husband inside of the Lady Chapel. And this tomb today has a lifelike, ornate effigy of the King and the Queen in recumbent poses. The pair had been reunited in death inside of the burial vault under the tomb, and the tomb cost a huge sum of £1,500 and was made by Pietro Torringio of Florence. Henry VII and Elizabeth's coffin were placed into the vault, which was 2.7 metres long and 1.5 metres high, and it is not the smallest vault inside of the abbey. Their wooden coffins have lead-lined coffins inside, and they were then covered with symbols such as the Maltese crosses, but the burial vault of Elizabeth of York was broken into a number of times. For the first time in 1603, the vault was opened, and this is, let's remember, many decades after the pair had died. The vault was opened for a specific purpose to begin with, and this was to inter the body of Elizabeth I, the final Tudor monarch. She was a queen and great-granddaughter of Elizabeth of York and Henry VII. She was to be buried in their tomb as a tribute to her, and because of the space inside of the vault, the coffin of Elizabeth and Henry may have actually been moved to the side, taken off the trestles, and moved across to make way for Elizabeth I's larger coffin. Elizabeth I was laid to rest alongside her grandparents for some years, but not forever, as the burial vault would be opened again. When James I succeeded Elizabeth I, he commissioned a huge tomb of the final Tudor Queen to be made, and with this he then ordered the removal of Elizabeth's coffin from the burial vault to be then placed in a different vault entirely, one that is roughly 10 metres away. He would inter Elizabeth in the same vault as her half-sister Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary, and Elizabeth I was interred directly above Mary to symbolise her superiority even in death. But King James, despite wanting to honour his predecessor, he also wanted to steal a space inside of the burial vault at the heart of the Lady Chapel. Elizabeth I's coffin would later be replaced by that of King James I himself after his death. To make way for James's coffin after his death, it is known that the wooden coffins of the Tudors, including Elizabeth of York, had been removed from the burial vault to then inter James inside of the vault. So the protective wooden coffin of Elizabeth was removed, and just left inside the vault was the tightly wrapped cerecloth corpse of Elizabeth of York and the lead inner coffin. This, of course, made Elizabeth's remains more exposed to the air and elements, meaning that they may have decomposed much quicker than what was intended. Also at the time, the visceral urns containing the hearts of Elizabeth of York and Henry VII, and their internal organs which were cut from their bodies after death to help with the decomposition process slow down, were moved. These were not found inside of the burial vault and had been placed somewhere else. So interred inside of the burial vault now was the first Tudor king and queen, and also the first Stuart king of England and Scotland. Elizabeth of York's body was left for some time in the state it was left in, but yet again the vault was opened, but this time in the 1860s, specifically 1869, when the Dean of Westminster, Arthur Stanley, who had been allowed to open the royal vaults of Westminster Abbey to conduct research, ventured into the burial vault of Elizabeth of York. He was looking for the coffin of James I, and he found this inside the vault with Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and he noticed that the bodies were shrouded inside of the vault, and he sketched an eerie image showing the three wrapped bodies lying side by side in a dark vault. He claimed that it was a feeling of breathless anxiety amounting to solemn awe, which caused the humblest of workmen employed to whisper in bated breath, as the small opening at the apex of the arch admitted the first glimpse into the mysterious secret which had hitherto eluded this long search. When he peered inside of the tomb, Stanley noticed that the 3 bodies were very tightly packed into each other, and that the vault was 5.5 foot beneath the floor of the crypt. The stone floor of the vault was known to have been pristine, and no condensation was noted. But there was a deadly chill in the vault. But with this it was found that Elizabeth's body was in the centre of her husband and King James. Her lead-lined coffin had been decorated with a Maltese cross engraved on the lid. There are some beliefs that the grave gods have been taken from the burial vault, and that there were things that were missing, including the visceral urns. But the burial vault of Elizabeth of York was sealed up, and this was the last time that it was opened. Elizabeth of York was the first Tudor queen, and she was interred inside of Westminster Abbey and was then exhumed following her death, before she was buried in a vault where she today is still left 500 years after her death. Elizabeth of York was someone who united the nation following the civil war of the Wars of the Roses with her marriage to Henry VII, but in death today she is still laid to rest inside of the tomb at the heart of the Lady Chapel that her husband built to become a Tudor mausoleum. And in the adjacent vaults her grandchildren are also buried closely. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.